The disruption did not arrive as a warning or a declaration. It arrived as an absence. Western defense contractors opened their procurement schedules and found that magnet allocations critical to guidance systems and precision motors were simply gone, removed without delay notices or rerouting explanations. What made the disappearance alarming was not the loss itself but the silence surrounding it. Nothing had been announced, nothing had been contested, and yet the materials no longer existed inside the system. China already understood what had happened, not because of an inspection or a confession, but because the material carried its own record. A batch of rare earth magnets that had moved through India under civilian licenses had entered Western military supply chains, and Beijing traced it back to a restricted Inner Mongolia facility using isotopic fingerprinting. Export licenses were suspended immediately, long before Europe identified the disruption or Washington began asking questions. By the time the gap was noticed, the system had already closed. What followed was not a supply shock, but a realization that control had shifted, and that it could be exercised without a single public move. China saw it first. Before European markets closed, Beijing's materials monitoring network matched the batch's atomic fingerprint to output from a restricted processing complex in Inner Mongolia. Bloomberg reported that Chinese regulators identified the isotopic signature within hours, linking the magnets to facilities already under national security controls. Export licenses tied to the originating producers were suspended immediately. By noon in Michigan, automakers warned suppliers of looming line stoppages. By nightfall, the same question rippled across Asia, Europe, and North America. How did 120 tons of Chinese rare earth magnets pass through India and surface inside Western military supply chains? The shock landed on an already stressed system. Earlier in the year, Beijing had overhauled its rare earth export regime, abandoning volume thresholds in favor of purpose-based licensing. Reuters reported that every shipment now required granular end-use disclosure, with customs officers instructed to halt exports until approvals cleared national security review. Applications piled up. Delays stretched into months. Ford's chief financial officer told Reuters that shortages were already distorting production schedules, forcing rationing across vehicle lines. What had once been a predictable industrial input had become a bottleneck governed by intent. So Beijing shifted its leverage, moving from simply controlling supply volume to focusing on strategic exposure. India, meanwhile, felt the pressure from another angle. According to customs data cited by Reuters, Indian imports of rare earth magnets actually surged beyond 50,000 tons in the previous fiscal year. But that increase wasn't really about abundance, it was about vulnerability. Even though India holds its own rare earth reserves, it still lacks enough refining and magnet-grade processing capacity. Mining, in this case, wasn't the real constraint, purity was. That gap honestly elevated one firm right into the center of the story. Sonic Kamar, a major Indian automotive component manufacturer, disclosed that it had imported around 120 tons of rare earth magnets from China and had plans to increase purchases to 200 tons as electric vehicle demand expanded. The company described these imports as a temporary bridge. Executives explained that Sonic Kamar was in the process of building domestic magnet capacity under India's production-linked incentive program, which is designed to reduce reliance on Chinese suppliers. Officials, echoed that framing publicly. But really, timing mattered. By mid-year, according to industry sources cited by the Financial Times, China had activated a nationwide digital tracking system requiring producers to upload shipment volumes, processing data, customer identities, and transport routes. The platform eliminated anonymity. End users could no longer disappear behind intermediaries. In October, Beijing tightened the screws again. 5 additional rare earth elements were added to the restricted list. Controls expanded from raw oxides to finished alloys and components. Even devices containing trace amounts of Chinese material now required licenses if Chinese equipment or know-how had been used during manufacturing. European manufacturers warned of rising costs and months-long approval queues. In the United States, defense-linked requests faced the harshest scrutiny. An Illinois-based magnet producer told the Wall Street Journal approvals had slowed to near zero. Washington responded with urgency. The U.S. Department of Defense announced hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for domestic refining and magnet facilities in Texas and California. Long-term offtake agreements were signed to guarantee demand. Partnerships with Australian miners and Greenlandic suppliers were accelerated to feed those plants directly. India launched parallel efforts. Officials drafted incentive packages to subsidize magnet production and establish strategic stockpiles. Senior industry figures told Bloomberg the objective was to shield automakers and defense contractors from sudden export freezes, but even supporters acknowledged the timeline measured in years. Engineers hunted for stopgaps. Motor designs were reworked to reduce reliance on heavy rare earths such as dysprosium and terbium. Substitutes like ferrites and alternative alloys were tested, often sacrificing efficiency or size. The magnet supply chain had ceased to be an industrial system. It had become a geopolitical filter. Beijing layered enforcement on top of scarcity. Quarterly audits required importers to submit proof that materials were used exactly as declared. Production orders, client rosters, delivery receipts all had to align. Reuters reported that regulators paired documentation with RFID tags and GPS-linked transport data, transforming compliance into a real-time ledger. What once lagged shipments now followed them live. Inside that regime, the diversion occurred. Chinese regulators determined that a batch imported under civilian licenses had been redirected and resold into Western military procurement channels. Isotopic fingerprinting linked the magnets back to restricted Inner Mongolia facilities, despite intermediary handling. According to officials briefed on the findings, the atomic signature eliminated plausible deniability. The material could not have come from elsewhere. The resale was not inferred, it was identified. Sonic Comar denied wrongdoing, reiterating that its imports were intended for electric vehicle motors and pointing to ongoing domestic capacity investments. Indian officials said they were reviewing documentation, but Beijing moved ahead regardless. Several foreign importers operating across civilian and defense markets were blacklisted pending investigation, freezing new export applications. Enforcement followed material evidence, not diplomatic pacing. One suspended license can idle an automotive plant or delay a weapons system. As Beijing's controls hardened, Washington and Brussels accelerated diversification. The Pentagon finalized long-term supply agreements with emerging United States magnet producers. Australian companies established processing partnerships inside the United States. European policymakers debated a continental critical minerals stockpile, mirroring energy security strategies from previous crises. The structural imbalance remained. According to United States Geological Survey data cited by the Financial Times, China still refined nearly 90% of global rare earth output. No alternative network could compensate for a comprehensive cutoff. Each regulatory change in Beijing moved prices, redirected capital, and reshaped industrial planning. For India, the calculation cut deeper. Despite reserves, it remained dependent on Chinese high-purity material for both civilian and defense manufacturing. The 120-ton shipment became a national marker of that exposure. Defense planners across multiple capitals reassessed risk. Joint ventures in Vietnam and Malaysia were explored to assemble components beyond China's licensing perimeter. Others pushed for rapid certification of substitute materials, accepting performance penalties. Beijing, meanwhile, refined its surveillance. The magnet tracking system embedded production coordinates and processing data into immutable digital signatures. Combined with isotopic analysis tying metals to specific mines, regulators achieved forensic visibility across global trade. When origin is provable at the atomic level, rerouting fails. Compliance stops being contractual and becomes physical. By year's end, nearly all major Chinese producers were integrated into the system, sealing pathways that once enabled mislabeling and diversion. Any inconsistency could trigger immediate suspension. Importers understood that every ton carried a traceable identity from mine to motor. Indian leaders responded rhetorically. Prime Minister Narendra Modi called for cooperative frameworks and warned against weaponizing critical minerals. Chinese officials countered that export licensing was a sovereign security function. Across boardrooms, realism replaced protest. European firms expanded recycling. U.S. investors poured money into alternative chemistries. Indian engineers raced to meet magnet-grade quality standards. Progress came incrementally, oversight did not. Western companies continued waiting months for approvals. Every announcement from Beijing sent procurement teams back to their risk models. In this fragile equilibrium, the 120-ton shipment remained the reference point. It showed how a single consignment could expose the wiring of the global economy. Factories can adjust, engineers can redesign, miners can dig, but policy moves faster than capacity, stockpiles grow slowly, refineries take years, rules change overnight. The magnets were never the crisis. The crisis was how easily one shipment revealed dependency. What is not familiar is the precedent that remains once the paperwork is closed. A system now exists where materials carry their own testimony, where origin can be proven after resale, and where enforcement no longer depends on cooperation or disclosure. From this point forward, every critical input moves under a different logic. Not price, not availability, traceability. Governments can deny intent, companies can dispute findings, and supply chains can reroute on paper, but none of that alters the underlying constraint. Control has shifted from contracts to chemistry, and once that shift occurs, it does not quietly reverse. The unanswered question is not whether another shipment will stall. It is whether the next one will be stopped deliberately or simply revealed. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support is appreciated. Thank you.